First Corinthians chapter 14 is potentially one of the most confusing chapters really in the whole Bible. So pay attention here because this might be news for you. So the issue here, Paul's talking about spiritual gifts in the church from chapter 12. And then in chapter 13, he talks about how love is more important than any of the gifts. And this is following in that same stream of thought. He says in verse 1, let love be your highest goal. He says, but you should also desire the special abilities the Spirit gives, especially the ability to prophesy. And so, he's talking about this prophesying. He's talking about speaking God's truth out. That's what he means by that gift. He says in verse 2, for if you have the ability to speak in tongues, you will be talking only to God, since people won't be able to understand you. So let me explain that real quick, and you can check out some other resources on speaking in tongues in our library if you're interested in that. But speaking in tongues is something that happened in the early church, and they would speak out in other languages, and it was a mysterious language. The speaker didn't know what he was saying because it was a spiritual thing. You can learn more about it in Acts chapter 2 and chapter 8 and chapter 10, and where you see some examples of them speaking out in other languages. In the Corinthian church, many of the Christians spoke in these other languages. It was one of their spiritual gifts. It's in the list in chapter 12, speaking in tongues. Again, if you've never seen it before, you probably think it's a strange thing. Even if you have seen it in a church, you might even think it's a strange thing unless you also do it. But his point is this. Let's go back to what he's trying to say here. He says, if you have the ability to speak in tongues in verse 2, you'll be talking only to God, since people won't be able to understand you. You will be speaking by the power of the Spirit, but it will all be mysterious. But the one who prophesies, remember, prophesying is when you speak out God's truth to people. So he says, but the one who prophesies strengthens others, encourages them, and comforts them. A person who speaks in tongues is strengthened personally because it's a personal spiritual gift that edifies and strengthens the person who is speaking in tongues. But the one, he says, the one who speaks a word of prophecy strengthens the entire church. So do you see what he's saying is he's tying all of these concepts together, because the Corinthian church, they had gotten to the point where they felt like speaking in tongues was what was sort of a badge of honor. The people who could speak in tongues thought that they were maybe a little more spiritual than the other people. And even in churches today that do this thing, that the speaking in tongues thing, sometimes that is even true in those kinds of churches today. It feels like a badge of honor. And Paul's trying to teach them that no. He's not saying that tongues is wrong. You'll see that later in the chapter. He's just saying that prophecy is better because it edifies the whole church. It strengthens the church because when someone speaks God's truth out, like someone gets up and teaches something, right? Teaches from the word or shares a scripture or something from the Bible, then everyone actually understands what's happening. But when someone speaks in tongues, nobody really understands what is being said. And so you can read this for yourself. Maybe this will help this make a little more sense to you. He says this, and the same is true for you, since you are so eager to have the special abilities that the Spirit gives, seek those that will strengthen the whole church. So he's saying, it's okay to speak in tongues, but even more important is to speak out the truth in the language that everyone understands, because that will strengthen the whole church. And he explains this a little bit more, and he says in verse 18, I thank God that I speak in tongues more than any of you. So this was a gift that Paul had, a spiritual gift that Paul had. He says, but in the church meeting, in public, he says, I would rather speak 5 understandable words, prophesy in other words, to help others than 10,000 words in an unknown language. And so what Paul's doing, he's trying to bring a fine point onto it. He's not saying that they shouldn't speak in tongues, but he's saying, really in this context, he's saying it's more of a personal thing, and save it for your personal prayer life, your personal relationship with God. But in public, in a church meeting, it's really not as appropriate to do. It's really something you should say for your private life, but in public, you should really focus on the gifts that strengthen the whole church. Again, you can read that a little bit more. And he summarizes in verse 26, well, my brothers and sisters, let's summarize. When you meet together, one will sing, that was a gift. Another will teach, that was a gift. Another will tell some special revelation God has given, that was a gift. One will speak in tongues, that's a gift. And another will interpret what is said. But he says this, but everything that is done must strengthen all of you. So he's saying this is kind of the rule. The overall rule is it should be orderly. It shouldn't be just complete mayhem and out of control. It should be orderly, and it should be done properly. And he says at the end here in verse 39, so my dear brothers and sisters, be eager to prophesy, speak out God's truth. And he says, and don't forbid speaking in tongues. So again, don't misunderstand this passage here. He's not saying that the gift of tongues is bad or wrong. He's just saying to be sure that everything is done properly and in order. Now, depending on the church that you're from or your own spiritual background and all that kind of stuff, you might take this chapter as you read it, you might take it in a little bit of a different direction, but read chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians. Check out some of the other resources in our library at pursuegod.org to learn more about this if you're interested. And really, more than anything, make sure that you don't forget the main point. It's all about loving other people, building the church up, building the body up, not just building yourself up. That's 1 Corinthians 14.